Hello, everybody. This is Megan,
And this is Alana.
and welcome to Tea Time Crimes.
Halloween edition.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm fine. Happy to be back here for spooky season.
Yeah.
So, did you have any ghost sightings after?
No, I
None?
didn't.
Not a one?
Not a
Well,
one.
still time. It's early. It's early yet. It's very early in the season. Who knows?
Oh,
I have
boy.
another case that I've put together for you today. Well, I had nothing to do with it other than reading.
You're saying you orchestrated all of
Took
it?
no part
You're
in it.
behind it. People, please take note.
No, it's brutal, and it's not something I would normally do, but here we are.
No, now I'm scared.
Yeah. So start us off with that nice, warm, comforting tea.
Fuck. Where did I put it? It's right here, and I brought the box up.
The tea is missing. It's
Oh, I see the box.
a thrilling start to the episode. Alana's still recording from the closet because she's trying to set stuff up still and all that. So the tea is stuck in a corner. You get it?
Got it.
All right. Lay it on us.
It's actually another one of your gifts, and
Woo.
it is Hot Cinnamon Sunset, and it's orange, which you can see now, and the listeners will see later.
Yeah, with the power of photography.
Exactly.
It is a beautiful Halloween color.
It is. I couldn't not do it. Character. Assertive, yet smooth, with sweetness and spice from cinnamon, cloves, and orange peel. So it sounds like they're going for the classic cinnamon tea that we've kind of seen here before. I did put a touch of milk because it's black tea. So
Yes. A
we'll
touch
see.
of milk?
A touch. Not a
I would put a
normal amount.
whole hug.
I don't think the body can take it. Let's see. I mean, it is overwhelmingly cinnamon. I don't really get orange notes on the smell. Oh, it's so good though.
Really? That was a happy face.
It's like going in, when you go into like a fall like store and like the smells that you get.
The
It
candles.
just feels like, it feels like that in a gulp, but like a good one. And it just is instant comfort.
Like apple cider donuts, cinnamon,
Oh,
pumpkin
it's so
candle.
good because like if this was a herbal tea, I don't think it would have that same comfort, but because it has some body, it's like sinking into like a big, what do you call those chairs from the 90s? The big like
Beanbag?
Yeah.
Sophie pees in beanbags.
Oh.
Yeah,
I
she
guess
thinks it's
the
litter.
That kind of makes sense.
So less
Sophie.
comforting if you have a Sophie in the house.
Yeah,
but
maybe don't do that.
I get it.
And yeah, you kind of, this one's kind of furry and then you just like fall into it.
Oh, nice.
Wow. Yeah, this is really nice. I would say a fall comfort thumbs up.
I love it.
That's really nice.
Good. Well, you're going to need it.
Great.
I know.
Oh, no.
Typically, right, we do point of view from the female side because that's more interesting to you. This one, the women are there, but they're a little bit on the periphery. So I wouldn't normally do this, but here we go. On Halloween morning of 1828, a woman by the name of Mary Docherty went missing, or so the police were told. In fact, a local woman by the name of Mrs. Gray had found Mrs. Docherty dead under the bed of William Burke. But by the time the police arrived, the body was gone. The only thing left was the straw she'd been covered with and a few drops of blood, which Burke and his friend William Hare quickly explained away. Mrs. Docherty had simply left town, they said, and they had no idea where she'd ended up.
Left town to the underworld.
Further investigation led the police to a doctor's office where they quickly discovered the body of Mrs. Docherty stuffed
Don't say it.
in a tea chest, awaiting dissection.
Would we say that's a trunk?
I think, yes.
Why does it have to be a tea chest? We're ruining it.
Agreed.
But I guess it really is a tea time crime.
Exactly. I couldn't pass it up when I read that.
Dear God.
But it gets really brutal. You might want to dust off the earmuffs for a couple
Right
parts. No, you're good for now. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. Before the mid-1800s, body snatching was a very popular profession in Scotland because, frankly, the supply and demand was there.
What? Have we talked about this before?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah,
I'm going to reference
familiar.
another case. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll name drop that crazy lady.
Yeah.
The only legal way to obtain a body for medical study was typically from a convicted criminal.
Yes. Okay, it's all coming back.
So, one, that's not nearly enough to meet this weird demand that's needed. And two, you can't really rely on the timing of that because you don't know when somebody's going to be convicted and when you're going to actually have a body to dissect for your anatomy lecture. Yeah. Thus, the need for these body snatchers, or resurrectionists, which is a much nicer term, that's what they were called, became very popular. They would dig up an already deceased body, sell it to the anatomists for study or for lectures. And as you can imagine, the grave robbers not only had to steal a corpse, but they had to steal one that was recently dead because they needed it to be a viable subject. This meant that families started going to great lengths to protect the graves of their loved ones.
Crazy.
They would build iron gates around the plots, which they called death safes. And cemeteries started having 24-hour watchmen, or friends and relatives themselves would take turns guarding the gravesite until enough time had passed that they assumed the grave robbers wouldn't
I see.
attack the grave. But honestly, so few people had the resources or the time to do this that made the poor and the alone very easy targets. So by the 1820s, the profession of being a doctor had also grown in popularity. There were over 1,000 enrolled at the University of Edinburgh in the medical program. This increased the business. It's just getting better now for the resurrectionists. They just don't know another way to study. Like, how are they going to learn?
Crazy.
They literally know so little about the body
it's a wild arrangement. You think they could come up with something better.
Yeah. It's creating 2 employment opportunities at a time when employment in life is rough. So if you have the means and the intelligence, you go the doctor route.
Yeah.
If you have a
shovel.
quick way to a shovel and a quick way to make money and some arm muscles, you go the grave robber route and you are able to provide for your family. And the notion of grave robbing was seen as an interesting argument because many argued that it was for the good of humanity. They're stealing, true, but it might cure a disease or explain ailments for the next person. And so maybe had they, if somebody died from an unknown disease, if they had been able to study it 20 years ago, then that person would be alive. And that's the argument that doctors and grave robbers are often making.
But it'd be nice to consent to it. Like, I would consent to that.
I know. It would be nice for that. Less nice to me to think of you. But on the other hand, you are defiling a grave.
Yeah.
And they did not consent to it, like you said. And also the family doesn't love it.
Yeah, it's upsetting to the family the most. I mean, the other person's dead.
Obviously, cemeteries are sacred still, but back then, even more so.
Yeah.
If you're not buried in the right way, in the right place, and, and still today for many religions, it meant serious consequences. And it was very upsetting to families. 1820s Scotland, you aren't safe, even if you're dead. And everybody needs a corpse. All right? To give you an idea,
Christ.
Dr. Knox, who was a doctor and a lecturer, was so popular, he had 2 sessions a day, which meant he required 2 bodies a day.
Oh my God.
Because you can't do the same one.
That's a lot.
Yeah. He was happy to pay 7 to 10 pounds per body, which is a large amount of money at the time. That could be a good chunk of your salary for the entire year if you were employed as any kind of laborer.
Jeez.
So that would be months of salary.
So I get it. And
it was well known among the resurrectionists that Dr. Knox never asked questions. He paid well, and he simply told the men he did business with, because that's how they refer to it, The fresher, the better.
Ew.
Yeah, ew. That's exactly right.
Ew.
It's this attitude and absolute lack of regulation that led William Burke and William Hare down the path to become two of the most notorious serial killers in Scotland, with the unwavering devotion of their women, Helen McDougal and Margaret Hare.
Oh,
Here we go. William Burke was born in Ireland in 1792. Nothing? No accent?
boy. Well, I'm thinking about Mrs. Doubtfire. I'm still stuck in Scotland.
Mrs. Doubtfire. You have a Geneva Doubtfire?
Oh,
Her? Yeah,
yeah.
great. So good. He was not a man of means, but his parents were respected because of their work ethic. And at 19, Burke and his brother joined the army. Over the next 7 years, Burke would serve in the army, get married, and have 2 children. After his time in the service came to an end, he was some sort of servant. It sounded almost like a butler,
Okay.
a manservant. He did that for 3 more years. By 1818, family tensions rose to the surface,
Oh.
and rumors are that he had a fight with his father-in-law
Uh-oh.
and then abandoned his wife and children
Nice.
to move to Scotland.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Although not officially divorced from his wife, Burke picked up life in Scotland as if he were single. He started working at the Union Canal and started a relationship with Helen McDougal eventually.
Uh-oh.
Yep. The book, The Infamous Burke and Hare, Serial Killers and Resurrectionists of the 19th Century, Edinburgh by R. Michael Gordon, quotes an article from the time describing Helen as the following. A woman of disreputable life, never possessed of any beauty. Rude. And Helen starting off
God.
strong.
That's so brutal.
Which at that time, the disreputable life, I assume means she was either a sex worker or had sex out of marriage and somebody knew about it,
God
because
forbid.
that's usually what they're talking about. But personally, I think what is more interesting for Helen's character is that she also abandoned her family.
Oh,
She left behind a
well, they have
husband
that in
and
common.
children of her own, and they found each other.
How nice of them. They deserve each other.
We don't know the whole story.
Yeah.
Who knows? But that's what happened. Based on their soon-to-be actions, I feel like I can say they might not be the best character standards that we want.
Dear God.
And the two of them would remain loyal to each other to the bitter end,
Hey.
which is surprising.
There we go.
Anyway, so once the canal was built, Burke was out of work, and the couple moved around and they landed in Edinburgh in 1827. The two of them held odd jobs. They're kind of finding work wherever they could, repairing shoes, mending clothes. Somebody said selling human hair, which makes me incredibly nervous, knowing what I know. How are you getting that hair?
They wouldn't have met Jamie. Jamie was in the U.S. by now.
The fictional character from Outlander. I can't remember his timeline.
I feel like Outlander is a cornerstone of our podcast at this point.
Outlander is the only history book I've read.
Yeah, same.
Sometimes they would even work on farms, Burke and Helen. Well, probably not Helen. She's busy being disreputable. That same year, Burke met his soon-to-be BFF, William Hare. Hare was living with his own woman, Margaret. They were not married, but they pretended to be, and she went by Margaret Hare.
Do you think they did the dirty too?
Well, I'm going to get into her. We'll see who you like best by the end. Burke was apparently quite a charmer, by the way. He could kind of talk to anyone. He played an instrument. Everybody talked about how well he danced. He could do a mean Irish jig. I guess that was important. People kind of liked Burke, or at least thought he was just kind of this average, run-of-the-mill kind of guy. Intelligent, very agreeable. Hare was maybe not the same.
Oh.
In the BBC documentary that's going to be listed in the notes, they tell a story of the two men, so Burke and Hare, out at a pub. They're paying for their drinks, but the bartender isn't picking up their money right away. So after they're done, Hare just takes the money and walks out, and Burke runs over and pays the bar tab for him. Right? And as they're leaving, an acquaintance calls Hare out and says, "How could you steal that money from your friend and then make him pay for it? You know, what's your problem?"
Yeah, that's stupid.
Hare immediately takes the guy to the ground and kicks him in the face.
Whoa. Anger.
Yeah. So he's less of a charmer.
Yeah.
He's also described as nervous, thin, rough, no intelligence, just the absolute kind of opposite of Burke.
Yikes.
Even though they might have differed on the surface, the two had a lot in common. Hare had also been born in Ireland and moved to Scotland around the same time.
Oh.
Just like Burke, he too found work on the canal. It's unknown if the two men met there for the first time or if it was a detail that they discovered later on and just had in common. Because there were so many people working on the project, it's completely feasible that they could have never met each other or just met in passing. Now, the rate at which these two men would become serial killers was so alarming. Many historians wonder how many people may have fallen victim to them before, but there's no record of it. Hare particularly was known for his violence and to be an incredibly mean drunk. So it seems unlikely that he would have gone on without ever really harming somebody and then just flipped a switch and went wild. But again, we don't know. But here's an example of some of those I don't know stories, because the meet cute of Hare and Margaret is everything you'd expect. Hare was living in the Logue boarding house. And I say Logue because the business was run by Margaret Logue and her then husband, James Logue. So this is his soon-to-be Margaret Hare. Hare and Margaret began an affair.
Giggity.
Which has got to be fun to do in a boarding house where your husband also lives. These aren't, they're on the West Wing.
That's wild.
James found out, kicked Hare to the curb. Very shortly after, James fell ill and passed away.
Oh boy.
But did he? Is the big question mark on that, right? Immediately upon James' death, Hare returned to the boarding house. Margaret, grieving process was quick. She's already confabulating with another boarder. She's good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she's fine. Hare destroys that boarder, kicks him out, and then moves in, and the two live as husband and wife, and that's when she starts going by Margaret Hare.
Okay.
Yeah, good times.
Wow.
In fact, it was Margaret who introduced Burke and Helen to Hare. So Burke and Helen, she found them out in the street. She's like, hey, I run a boarding house. You should come back. And that's how Burke and Hare met. And they started boarding at her house.
Jeez.
And Hare and Burke were soon referred to as like brothers.
Okay.
Ugh. It did not take long before this foursome found each other.
Oh, swinging?
That the selling of bodies began.
Oh, dead bodies.
Yeah. So less exciting than swinging.
Yeah.
And definitely not a fun time. On November 29th of 1827, an elderly boarder, Mr. Donald, passed away, apparently from natural causes. But he passed away before he could pay his rent for the week. So Hare is furious.
Yeah, he really planned it.
He does not want to be left out of this check. He's not going to get paid for this. So he has the bright idea to get his losses back by just selling the body to the doctor.
So it's a little inappropriate.
And honestly, that's not even a kind of a new idea at the time.
Wow.
People were doing this, as you know, right?
It's just crazy.
It's very gross. And when I thought about it, in my head, I thought, oh, they must have discovered that he was dead and then immediately brought him right to the doctor from there. But they actually didn't. They reported the death, and then he had the idea after. So Mr. Donald is in a coffin, but he's not buried yet. This means that Hare needs help. So this is where he's like, hey, Burke, we're buddies. Come here. They pull the body of Mr. Donald out, and then they fill the coffin with heavy things so nobody knows.
Okay. Hopefully not a pot, because that would make a weird noise.
No, they said they filled it with pieces of leather.
Leather?
Yeah, they were next to a tannery.
Okay.
And then they went to the university to sell the body, and they were looking for a Dr. Monroe. So these two guys arrive on campus. They have a body in a bag, and they ask a student for directions. They're looking for Dr. Monroe. The student says, don't go to Monroe, go to Dr. Knox, which historians think was probably a pivotal point, because you'll see the character of Dr. Knox play out that just feeds this, where we don't know what Dr. Monroe would have done. There's no way to know that. So they first arrive. Dr. Knox's assistants are surprised. They're like, what are you doing here? It's the middle of the day. You can't just bring a body. Like, come back after the sun sets, duh. So, they're new to this process. There's a learning curve. They go home. They wait for the sun to set. And then they go back. And Dr. Knox examines the body and paid them £7 10 shillings and said he'd love their repeat business. This is way more money than Mr. Donald even owed.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, for a week's rent.
Yeah, so Hare is like, this is it.
He's like, yeah,
This is
here we
easy work.
go. Yeah.
Let's do what we can do. And this is where they try to make their own opportunities because they're not assuming we think this is the truth, that he died of natural causes, you know, they're not going to always have that opportunity fall in their laps. So they are able to create something without ever picking up a shovel. They never, ever dig a grave.
What?
Not once. So,
Jeez.
and they were not the first people to do this. In
Yeah.
1752, two women were executed, Helen Torrance and Jean Waldy, for murdering a boy for the purpose of selling his corpse. And I don't know how much Burke and Hare knew of this because it was the one crime and then they were executed. So it's very possible they hadn't heard of this. But I'm just saying they're not the first. By the time Burke and Hare were stopped, they confessed to murdering 16 people.
Oh my God.
But this list of victims was cobbled together from confessions of Burke and Hare after the fact. So there's no way to know if it's complete or if they're lying or if they overlap or if they forgot somebody or if they didn't tell about certain people. And many people will claim that it's over 30 bodies during that time period.
Oh.
If you believe them, Mr. Donald had fallen into their lap, a sick elderly man who died of natural causes.
Mm-hmm.
But
Just
from
like
there
James.
on, the men had to create their own luck.
They're really not doing good advertising for the boarding house if they're going down this path.
Right? Well, here's what they do. They would invite people they deemed good candidates back to the boarding house. Drinks, food, music, place to sleep. Once they fell asleep, the men would murder them, and thus the term burking was invented, which was the case you were talking about earlier, the Eliza Ross case.
Yes.
She was found guilty of burking her victim, and this is how the term was invented.
How would they kill them again?
Hare would sit on their legs.
Okay.
Burke would sit on their chest and he'd put his hands over their nose and mouth and he'd hook his fingers kind of under their chin and close their nostrils and mouth together.
Yeah.
And then just wait.
Oof. It's a violent image.
Yeah, it's gross. After Mr. Donald, the first or the next victim, depending on what you believe happened there, is Joseph the Miller. And that's in December of 1827. He's a beggar. So they start really quickly honing in on people who don't have a lot of family or are alone or don't have a regular place to stay. Joseph had been staying at the boarding house, and like Mr. Donald, he became ill. But he would have recovered, is the general consensus. They were like, yeah, he was sick, but he would have been fine.
Well.
But it did weaken him. And for this murder, which let's say it's their first, if we go by that logic, there is this weak outline of a conscience because they tried to convince themselves that the man was sick, like Mr. Donald, and they were sparing him. There was a little bit of rationalization there. All hints of that are gone after this one, but again, more than likely, he would have survived. So the men get Joseph drunk, or they drug him. Usually they would get people drunk, and then they suffocated him.
Damn.
Dr. Knox paid 10 pounds for Joseph's body.
Whoa.
No questions asked. It would be a couple of months before Burke and Hare admitted to trying again. And in February of 1828, they found their next victim, an Abigail Simpson, who was a salt peddler. Burke and Hare met Abigail at the pub, and they zeroed in on her because of her advanced age. That was another tactic.
Mm-hmm.
They would go for usually elderly people. And the fact that she was alone and from out of town.
Yep.
So Hare and Burke are buying her drinks. They listen to her talk. She's lonely. She doesn't know anybody. She's talking about her single daughter. And Hare pretends to be interested in marrying her and says, come back to our house so we can work out the details. Abigail agreed. And then the two men meet Helen and Margaret at the door. Burke and Hare did such a good job of getting Abigail drunk that they too passed out. And the next morning, Abigail's still alive. So they offer her more whiskey and wait for her to fall back asleep.
Whiskey for breakfast.
I know, gross. Hair of the dog. Then Burke and Hare told Helen and Margaret to step out of the room, and they murdered Abigail.
Ooh.
And it's believed that Helen and Margaret, this is it. They know exactly what's happening. Maybe they didn't know for Mr. Donald. Maybe they didn't know for Joseph, but by this, they do. And it's worth noting that even that's unlikely because the way the houses are built, they're so tiny and the rooms are so small. To be living in a home all the time and be staying there permanently, it would be wild for you not to kind of pick up on what's going on.
Also, didn't we think that Donald got sick?
Mr. Donald was sick.
Yeah.
And supposedly died of natural causes, yeah. But Joseph was then supposed to be sick and they killed him.
Yeah.
So Abigail's body placed in a tea chest. Now they know to wait till sunset. Dr. Knox pays £10. With this influx of funds, Burke and Hare started spending it, eating at restaurants, drinking most of it.
Nice.
And it was a weird split, which I don't understand. It was not 50-50. Let's say they got £10. Hare received £5. Burke received 4, and Margaret received 1. I mean, and maybe this is like, again, this is coming from them or one of them, so who knows?
Interesting.
But still, it's enough money to keep both men buying things and not working.
Sure.
Following Abigail's murder, a sick match seller and a boarder became their next easy target. This man was traveling alone from England, and they could not even recall his name. The victim after that, also unnamed. But Margaret Hare was said to be brought even more into this murderous business because she was the one who picked out this elderly woman and invited her back to the boarding house for drinks and then left the room. Now, Burke was said to murder another unnamed woman alone when an opportunity presented itself, whatever that means. But he still made sure to split the money with Hare. But at this point, you'd have to show me some pretty strong evidence to the contrary for me to think that Helen and Margaret don't know what's going on.
They absolutely do, and they're helping in their own ways.
Yeah, because it benefits them from the money.
Yeah, of course.
That's it. And I also don't love Dr. Knox already.
No, he's the one fueling all of this. If he didn't have this practice, then this wouldn't be happening. Period.
I could make an argument for now he might think they're grave robbers, but there will be very clear points through these victims where you know he knows.
Yeah, and he doesn't care.
And he doesn't care.
Wow.
In April of 1828, 2 18-year-old sex workers who Burke was rumored to know, they weren't total strangers, like he knew them. I don't know if he was a client of theirs or what, but he knew them. I mean, these people that he's meeting, if they're not out of town, then they're almost fixtures in the town because people see them around all the time. They just don't necessarily have family.
Okay.
These 2 girls, Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, had spent the night in a holding cell for drinking, good stuff. They're minding their own business. They're in a pub now getting a morning drink. That's what you do.
Yep.
Burke spotted them and then starts buying rounds. He then invites them back to the house. Technically, this time not to Hare's boarding house, but he's sometimes staying at a family member's house, so he invites them back there.
Risky.
Mary is on board. Mary Patterson is like, free drinks. This sounds great. Yeah. Let's do it. Janet, for some reason, is hesitant. And again, this is a man she knows. So it's not like she's meeting this guy for the first time, but something is telling Janet,
don't do
this
it,
is
Janet.
Weird. So she goes, but she's very cautious. So
she's not slamming drinks.
Mary's slamming drinks and passes out pretty quickly or falls asleep.
Yeah.
Janet does not. Eventually, Burke expressed his interest in paying for Janet's services because Mary's asleep. And just as that transaction was about to occur, Helen McDougal showed up. And she peeks into the room, I am assuming expecting to see her fake husband murdering a girl, but instead he's doing very much of a living action.
Tapping the tree.
And he's confabulating, and Helen raised hell.
Oh. Okay, so that crosses a line.
That's Helen's line. Yeah, not ideal.
Boy.
Janet, jumps up and is like, whoa, didn't know, wasn't aware, apologies, I'm out.
Yeah.
And Helen quickly turns her attention on Burke and starts letting him have it. Those 2 get in a fight.
Janet, can you please extricate your friend?
Yeah, well, Janet says, I'm leaving. I'm going to get help, and I will be back for Mary. Everybody stay put, because Mary's unconscious, so she can't move her.
I'm worried about her.
So Janet goes back to the boarding house where her and Mary live together. And the woman who runs it, her name is Mrs. Lowry. She's amazing. She said, you need to go get Mary. Take a servant, go. So Janet and the servant go back to collect Mary.
Run.
But Burke is gone.
But Mary's there?
Mary is gone.
No.
Hare is there. Margaret is there. And Helen's there still screaming. Janet is told by probably not Helen, but the other 2, that Mary stepped out with Burke.
Lie.
So Janet says, I refuse to leave this house until my friend comes back, so I'll be
Good
right
for
here.
You.
But Mrs. Lowry catches wind of things and says, Janet, come back. She just knows something's wrong. She does not want Janet there. Janet had only been gone, they estimate 15, maybe 20 minutes. In that time, Burke had murdered Mary Patterson. So here's where Dr. Knox really changes for me, because up until now, you could make the argument that he thought they were grave robbers. But when Burke and Hare bring Mary to Dr. Knox's office, one of the assistants recognizes her.
Awkward.
He was a client of hers, and they'd spent the night together a few nights prior. But no questions are asked, and instead, Dr. Knox preserved Mary for 3 months so that others could take note of her perfect, beautiful form before he dissected her.
No. What did he actually do?
That's true.
What were they doing to the body?
What do you mean?
I don't know.
He preserved Mary in full form before her dissection so that people could draw her anatomy.
That's gross.
Yeah, he's gross. I don't know. I don't know if they
Ew.
were drawing, but whatever. One does.
Oh, I'm so grossed out.
And Janet, who avoided death, she didn't know where Mary was because she's not touring the college. She's not going to catch wind of this.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So she doesn't know. So she's still looking for Mary. That same month, Burke invited a cinder woman named Old Effie back to the house. She did not wake up.
He needs to get shanked.
Dr. Knox paid 10 pounds. Shortly after that, Burke and Hare, get this, they intercepted a policeman escorting a woman to the drunk take. They acted like they knew her and said, oh, she's our neighbor. We'll bring her home. You don't have to worry about it. She'll sleep it off. We got it.
That's bad in so many ways.
It's so awful. The policeman thinks, well, that's really great. Now I don't have to worry about this lady. She'll be home.
Yeah, give a drunk lady to some guys. Just that premise is horrible.
Well, yeah, the unnamed woman never woke up either. And she became part of Dr. Knox's lecture.
Dr. Knox?
I know, he's the
Piece
worst.
of shit.
Now, the next 2 cases are especially gruesome. So I will probably earmuff you for half of it. But
Okay.
One night, Burke is in the process of bringing a victim home, an elderly man, when he encounters a woman who's lost with her 12-year-old grandson. And so he tells the old man to beat it. And the old man's mad at him because he was promised whiskey. So the old guy's yelling at him and calling him names. And Burke's like, okay, bye. He has no idea that he's just dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
He tells this older woman, oh, you're lost. I know exactly where you're going. It's right on the way past my house. Duck in here. Let's get you a meal and then we'll send you on your way. Right? So they do. Burke got her absolutely inebriated on whiskey.
Why can nobody hold their liquor like, oh, I'm getting drunk. I better ease off a little bit.
I mean, these are people who they don't know when they're going to get their next drink, when they're going to get their next meal.
Yeah.
They're finally warm. They're finally safe.
That's fair.
Burke offers them a bed and a hot meal, and they just are like, oh, I can finally relax.
Yeah, that's true.
So Burke murders the grandmother. Now go ahead and earmuff. When he comes out of the bedroom, he's afraid that the boy will tell. So Burke was said to break the boy's back and then place the body in a barrel big enough for the boy and his grandmother. He brought them to Dr. Knox. No questions were asked.
Back.
I won't tell you what I said, but Dr. Knox should have been clued in.
Oh, no.
Based on the victim's age and the injury.
Oh, no.
By the summer of 1828, Helen and Burke were planning a vacation to Scotland. This meant that their little business would have to take a break.
Oh, no.
So during this time, it was suggested, some say by Hare, some say by Margaret, that they just convert Helen into, quote, merchandise.
What? Like pimp her out?
Burke said, Helen and I are going on vacation, and Hare was like, that's going to really put a damper on business. So either Hare or Margaret said, well, why don't you just kill Helen? And then, yeah, turn her into merchandise for Dr. Knox.
Oh.
Yeah. Burke refused.
Okay.
Which is shocking to me.
There's a line.
I know. We found his line for whatever reason. I'm sure he just needed something from her, but here it is. Maybe he thought it was too risky. He disagrees, and they move out shortly after because I think he's afraid that they might do it anyway.
Right.
Yeah. And Burke continued at this new residence, and he started with the murder of a laundry woman named Mrs. Ulstler. Shortly after, and some say as a compromise to letting Helen live, Burke and Hare then murdered Helen's cousin, Anne McDougal, while she was visiting.
Oh, this is getting ugly.
Right. You telling me you don't know Helen? Come on now.
This is getting ugly.
Hare brought in the next victim, inviting a woman named Mary Hallidane back for food and drinks. And Mary was reported to be a sex worker and or beggar and had been in the neighborhood for years. So everybody knows her.
Yeah.
She drank herself to sleep. The men murdered her. But Mary has children.
Oh, no.
So Mary's daughter, Peggy, comes looking for her mother. She knows the streets well. It took her no time at all to find several witnesses who were like, oh, yeah, I saw your mother here with Hare or Burke. Then she went here. Like, she could basically just canvass the neighborhood. She finds out that the last place she was seen was with Burke and Hare. So she shows up. She demands answers. Helen and Margaret tried to turn the table, saying a sex worker would not be allowed in their house. Knowing full well that one, obviously they were, and two, they know what happened to her mother.
Yeah.
So get over yourselves.
Ugh, gross.
Hare comes in and he tries to smooth everything over by offering free drinks and a plausible explanation that calmed Peggy down. He just said, oh, we did see her, but she had a chance to make some money, so, she went here. Don't worry about it. She'll be back on this day. He kind of gave her a story. And then Peggy also was murdered.
Yep.
Knox paid 10 pounds for each woman.
Ugh. Bomb.
So all of these murders happened in June. The laundry woman, Mrs. Ostler, Mary and Peggy Hallidane, and Anne McDougal, Helen's cousin. The neighborhood is starting to get a little suspicious because
okay, good.
They know, like I said, Anne and Peggy are always around. They're always in a certain area. They're always in a certain place. They're not there anymore, and bodies aren't being found.
Yeah.
Their absence is definitely noticed. And it could have been that the men decided they have enough money or they needed to cool off, but they kind of pumped the brakes because there are also rumors circulating that maybe a cannibal's on the loose. That's why there are no bodies. Like, people are kind of running wild with it.
Whoa.
And so I don't know if these rumors are getting back, but they kind of take a little bit of break.
Okay.
But in October of 1828, they pick up their old business with 18-year-old James Wilson. James Wilson was known as Daft Jamie.
Aww.
Jamie was described as having the mind of a young child and notoriously gentle, telling the children in the neighborhood jokes in an attempt to make them laugh. He was also constantly without shoes. So this was like, I say that because it was a characteristic that stood out. No matter what time of year it was, no matter what the temperature, he never had shoes on. He refused them. And so everybody kind of knew him from that. Like, that's the guy who never has shoes. FYI, my dad now doesn't wear shoes in a lot of public places, and it's super weird. So,
what?
You didn't know that? Yeah, it's his new thing. It says it helps his knees.
Like to the ice
to
cream
parks,
store?
To the car, and driving the car.
Oh, but not like to a restaurant.
In my house. Not places where it's not allowed.
Oh, that's okay.
But like, is it?
I do that.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm a barefoot kind of girl.
Yeah, in your yard. Yeah, sure. But would you walk to a public park? Would you drive there barefoot, walk through a public park, and then drive back to your home?
Probably not.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't. Anyway.
Raj.
Anyway. Jamie also has some family. Jamie has a mother in town, but they don't get along great. She doesn't know how to handle him. She's abusive at times. So he'd often live in the streets or he'd spend a night or two with certain families in exchange for doing odd jobs because he was physically very strong. So he would help out on farms or help out doing some sort of labor job. And then he would, find a place for the night. Now, nobody knows the exact date, but Jamie was walking the streets in search of his mother when he encountered Margaret Hare. Margaret said she knew exactly where his mom was and just come back to the house and they'd chat until his mother returned from her errand.
This is too sad.
So Jamie's waiting in the boarding house. Burke is across the street drinking at the pub. Margaret tells Jamie, wait here, I'll be right back. She goes across the street and apparently they have a signal in place. So if you had any doubt of how into this Margaret is, Margaret goes in,
no doubt,
walks up to the bar, steps on Burke's foot, and walks out. That means they have merchandise, as she would say. The usual ploy does not work with Jamie, though. He does not like to drink. So he spent the whole night asking for his mother, just taking very small sips of one whiskey. Margaret, Burke, and Hare simply waited him out and offered him a bed so that he fell asleep just naturally. But this is a man who survives off the kindness of strangers, so this isn't weird for him. It's a boarding house. They have a free bed. He goes to sleep.
feel like it'd be a lot harder to burk him because he's not drunk.
No, that's exactly what happens. Because besides the victim you were earmuffed for, Jamie's the first victim who is not sick or under the influence. Margaret apparently is fine with luring the victims in, but she still doesn't take part in the actual murder. However, once Jamie falls asleep, she locks the door from the outside so he can't get out. And then the men attack him. But Jamie woke up and he was not drunk. And so he fought like hell.
Yeah.
He
he's
actually
big.
got Burke on the ground, and Hare's in the corner of the room surprised, and he's yelling at Hare to help him, not realizing that they're in it together. And then both men attack him. Jamie was murdered that night. But just like with Mary Patterson, Jamie was also recognized by Dr. Knox's assistants. He was so well known around town.
I'm sure.
Plus, he was always barefoot, and he had one foot that was formed differently than the other.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also a characteristic. And this is where I know for sure Dr. Knox knew exactly what was going on in my mind, because Knox denied that he had Jamie when his mother came looking, because she did.
Wow.
And then he amputated anything that was recognizable.
Wow.
The one foot and his face.
Ew.
Yeah, exactly.
Fuck that guy, man.
And that brings us to the final murder, the one that we started with on Halloween night.
On Halloween.
The morning of the 31st, Burke was at a pub drinking when Mrs. Mary Docherty entered. This woman is from out of town. She's from Ireland. She has an accent.
With a name like that, Docherty.
I know. Burke quickly befriends her. She's there looking for her son. He tells her they have a distant relative, their family. Let me buy you some drinks. Oh, come back to the house, meet my wife, have a meal, all of that. Mrs. Docherty was so thankful to have someone to talk to, a warm place to stay, hot meal. It's also Halloween night.
Right.
Which is huge.
Yes.
It's a fun time.
Yeah.
They have a big party. She dances all night.
Ugh.
Before midnight, as the party was thought to have died down, Burke, Helen, and the Hare's neighbor heard a cry for help. They heard somebody yell murder. So this man apparently went for help, couldn't find anybody, went back to the house, and all was quiet. And so he eventually thought that somebody was just too drunk and being crazy.
Yeah.
But the next morning, Helen and Burke had people over for breakfast who had been at that party. The Grays. So the Grays show up. They're having breakfast like normal human beings. They say, "Hey, where's Mrs. Docherty? Did she leave already? Did you guys have, what happened after we left?" That, making conversation. Helen said, quote, "I kicked the damn bitch's backside out of the door for she was making o'er free with my William." Okay,
Whoa.
Helen, that didn't happen, and calm down. Mrs. Gray, I think, becomes suspicious at this point because from what I could gather, Mrs. Docherty is a very elderly woman who at no point showed any interest in Burke or Hare, and was
not
just
the right thing to say.
Was like, "I don't think that's what was happening." And so she's looking for some of her belongings because she had been there, and she comes across a pile of straw, and Burke freaked out, started screaming at her to get away from it. "What are you doing over there?" And then he took a whiskey bottle and he started throwing whiskey around the room, like the liquid of it, not the bottle, but like almost like he was anointing the room. I don't know. And Mrs. Gray thought, "Dude, what is going on right now? This is so strange." And so she was like, "No problem. Don't need to look under the bed." I think she was looking for some of her kids.
Oh.
So she just ignores them. And then when they're not paying attention, she looks under the bed again because she thinks this is so weird. I can't handle it. And that's when she discovers the body of Mrs. Docherty. So the Grays make a fast exit, but not before Helen intercepts them at the door.
Uh-oh.
You would have to have a Hall of Fame poker face to get out of this situation. Yeah, it's pretty clear like they've seen some stuff.
Not good at this.
No, she's terrible. They immediately, Helen, now Margaret's joining in too, the women, they're there. They are pleading with them not to go to the police, and Margaret says she'll pay £10 a week if they just keep their mouth shut. Which, that's an extreme amount of money. There's no way she could have keep that up. So she was obviously like, "We'll kill you later."
More people.
Yeah, exactly. But either way, the Grays are like, "Nah, we out." So they leave. As soon as they leave, Burke and Hare work just as fast. They getting Mrs. Docherty to Dr. Knox, both for the payout and to get rid of the evidence. So by the time the police arrive, Mrs. Docherty is gone.
Was the straw a normal thing? Did they always have straw?
Yeah, it was like a straw mattress, I think.
Oh, okay.
Maybe like a straw mat. But so many people have seen Mrs. Docherty with Burke and Hare
Yeah.
that investigators are still suspicious because they're like, I know that her body's not there now, but like, how often does Mrs. Gray say that it's going to be there?
Right.
The investigators questioned Burke and Helen separately because
Okay.
it's their house. Helen, unfortunately for her, has a real issue with AM, PM, which I fully get. I mess up time zone meeting invites all the time. But Burke says Mrs. Docherty left at 7 a.m. that morning. And Helen says Mrs. Docherty left at 7 p.m.,
Oh,
which doesn't work because that was literally during the party and tons of people saw her after 7 p.m.
Helen's a mess.
She's an absolute mess. It's totally different from what Burke said. So now they're
Yeah.
like, okay, all right, guys, what's going on? So they search the house. They find some blood evidence. They find Mrs. Docherty's clothes. And then a tip comes in, anonymous, that they should go to Dr. Knox.
Who did the tip?
I don't know. So they go to Dr. Knox and they find Mrs. Docherty stashed away in the corner in that tea chest.
Yes.
Well, it seems like a slam dunk.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the death at that time cannot be ruled 100% as murder. It could have either been suffocation accidentally because she was inebriated or she was suffocated intentionally. But once the public caught wind of this, people started putting the pieces together. People who had been looking for Jamie, Janet, who'd been looking for Mary, right?
Yeah.
All
Can
these
we
people.
still blame Dr. Knox? Hello.
I know, right? Burke and Hare had kept some items from Mary, from Jamie, from others, which is such serial killer behavior.
True.
Burke is denying everything. He says he has 100 different reasons where Mrs. Docherty went away. Another man came to his house, and that man left the dead body under his bed.
Yeah, that seems likely.
I'm just kidding. Mrs. Docherty's still alive. She's in the next town over. Did you guys not? I mean, he's just all over the place.
Okay.
Wild.
He's lost it.
Nobody believes that they're innocent, but they don't have as much evidence as they'd hope. And the fact that Dr. Knox won't just give them a complete list of who they've dropped off at his door tells you everything you need to know about Dr. Knox. He won't say anything. So the first tactic was to go to Helen and Margaret. The women refuse to give up Burke and Hare.
Really? I feel like Helen would give in immediately.
Nope. Hare, however, has no problem turning on Burke. And for complete and total immunity, Hare recounted every murder he could recall, saying Burke was in charge, not him, which people think is actually the opposite.
Right, because wasn't he getting a pound more?
Yeah, and it was also his idea. And he's also the mean one.
Yeah.
Serial killer comparisons. Saying Burke was always in charge. He was just doing what he was told. But he says Helen and Margaret had no idea about it. He leaves them out of it.
Interesting.
Yeah. So still, even denying the ladies' involvement, it's Burke and Helen who are charged with the murder of Mrs. Docherty.
Really?
Hare and Margaret could potentially be set free. Now, the trial started on Christmas Eve of 1828.
Oh.
And it was over by Christmas Day. Remember, big issue here is they can't say for sure it was murder. And they don't have the other bodies, so they are only starting with Mrs. Docherty. Helen and Burke are on trial together, which is wild that it's not Burke and Hare, but it's Helen and Burke.
Weird.
The Caledonian Mercury, by way of the book The Infamous Burke and Hare, quoted the following descriptions. So Burke was dressed in a shabby blue surtout, I think is how you say it. I don't know. Coat? Surtout? I don't know. Surtout? Anyway, he's got a jacket on.
It went with his muff. It's fine.
Button close to the throat. He goes on to say, there is a hardness about the features, mixed with an expression in the gray twinkling eyes, far from inviting.
Oh.
And then they annihilate Helen.
Oh, boy.
Quote, the female prisoner is fully of the middle size, but thin and spare made, though evidently of large bone. So she's all the things.
What?
She's all the
things. I
things.
have no idea what she looks like from that.
Her features are long, and the upper half of her face is out of proportion to the lower. She was miserably dressed in small gray-colored velvet bonnet, very much the worse for wear, a printed cotton shawl and cotton gown. And they go on to describe her posture, annihilating that as well. They end with that she had ordinary look of extreme poverty and misery common to unfortunate females of the same degraded class.
Oh, boy.
Yikes. Yeah.
They shouldn't be poor, though, after all those pounds.
Well, I don't know how much. Helen didn't get any of the cut.
Oh, true.
The trial talks to everyone who had seen Mrs. Docherty that day. They retrace her steps and prove that she ended up with Burke and Hare. She was there at a party. right? It's not like they was alone.
Yeah, everybody saw her.
They interviewed neighbors. More than one person heard a woman scream murder. There was also a porter who helped move Mrs. Docherty, not only in the chest, but they helped put her in the chest. So they saw the body.
Oh.
All of this is great. But the biggest thing, again, is maybe they were just moving a dead body. Maybe they're just grave robbers. Maybe they're just resurrectionists.
Okay.
Well, Hare, the eyewitness, he could not be happier to step up and tell. He's loving the attention. Yeah, he's the worst. He's the eyewitness, and he described Burke murdering Mrs. Docherty by suffocation while he was in the room just sitting in a chair not doing anything.
What?
He made sure not to say he ever touched the body. Burke, of course, will later state that they murdered Mrs. Docherty in the same manner as all the other victims and that Hare was very much involved. But Hare has immunity. So if he testifies, he gets off.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. Margaret does not have the same deal. Both men say that the women were involved. So Margaret has a baby with Hare. So she chooses to bring the baby up and use it as like a little bit of a prop.
Yep.
And if she's not sure how to answer a question, like suddenly, oh, the poor baby, right? The thought of those two having a child while this is going on is
terrifying.
She basically just says everything that Hare said, except she wasn't in the room, right? She was make sure to put herself out of the room.
Yeah.
The defense says 0 witnesses, not one. Burke's lawyer focused on the fact that it could not be determined 100%. They're like, hey, he's not the best. He's a grave robber. It's gross, but he didn't murder anyone.
Yeah.
That is the best they can do. This trial went straight through the night, which I didn't know was a thing. The prosecution rested their case at 3 a.m. Christmas morning. They just kept going.
That's crazy. Obviously wouldn't not work today.
So from 3 to 5, Burke's lawyer went. From 5 until the end, Helen's lawyer went. And his argument essentially boiled down to, hey, listen, you don't have to say that Helen's innocent. In Scotland, you can just say that it's not proven. And you can't prove that Helen ever murdered anybody. 8:30 in the morning, the jury starts deliberations. It takes about an hour for them to return with their decision. William Burke, guilty. Helen McDougal, not proven. Burke was said to be a little bit of a mess back in his cell, not super pumped. He was also upset that he was never paid for Mrs. Docherty's body because he could really use a good pair of pants to die in.
Excuse me?
Yeah, that's what we're dealing with.
Ew.
He was sentenced to death by hanging, and people wanted to see it done. They were very angry. Windows that overlooked the execution went for 5 to 20 shillings so they could view it.
Boy.
About 25,000 people stood in line to watch.
Oh my God.
Or not in line, but like in the crowd to save their spot. And it was pouring rain most of the day, and they stood there anyway.
What?
Just after 8 a.m. on January 28th, 1829, Burke walked the steps to the hangman's noose. The massive crowd started yelling in anger, demanding Hare join him.
That's what I was like. Burke must be so
they're
pissed
furious.
that Hare's not there as well.
And they're telling the executioner to save the rope and just burk him.
Oh.
The crowd cheered as the platform was dropped and Burke took his last breath. Just before 9 a.m., Burke's body was taken down and eventually moved to the university for dissection.
The irony.
Dr. Monroe, the Dr. Hare and Burke had originally sought out that very first night, and Dr. Knox's rival was the one who performed the public autopsy.
Wow. That is ironic.
Burke's body was then put on for a public viewing before its final resting place at the Anatomical Museum, where his skeleton can still be seen today.
Weird.
Yeah. So despite the public's protests and the court looking for a loophole, Hare was set free February 5th, 1829.
He had to have been mobbed.
Some of the families attempted to file suits and they just couldn't.
Yeah.
They wouldn't accept it.
But like just kill him anyways, you know what I mean?
Well, he had to change his name, covertly move out of town, and even then, mobs just kept recognizing him and trying to kill him.
Good for you guys.
History is not sure what happened to Hare, although most believe he ended up a blind beggar on the streets of London who had been blinded while being recognized and forced into a kiln that caused his blindness. And it's believed that he died destitute and alone around 1858. Margaret and Hare never saw each other again. She was released from prison before Burke was executed.
Okay.
And just like with Hare, the public wanted her dead. She narrowly escaped more than one mob attack before having to flee to Ireland with her child. And nobody knows what happened to her.
Jesus Christ.
Helen refused to testify against Burke, as we know. She even tried to visit him before the execution, but was denied access. Burke passed his last possessions to Helen,
Okay.
which were, small things.
Yeah.
Although the courts may have found her innocent, the public did not.
Yeah.
And the National Library of Scotland has a broadsheet in its possession that claims Helen escaped to Glasgow and then Reading, only to be identified by an angry mob comprised mostly of females who grabbed her by the hair, choked her, and ended her life by stomping on her chest.
Whoa, that's violent.
Other newspaper accounts say that she was burned to death at the age of 70.
Oh my God.
So none of them got away with, well, maybe Margaret did, I don't know.
Damn.
After this case, the Anatomy Act would be passed in 1832. So this meant bodies could be donated to medical schools only
There we
if
go.
they died at a hospital and were unclaimed for 3 days, which put an end to all of
Yeah.
this kind of yuck.
Yeah, I was like, there's much better arrangements to be added and like some regulation that's not that hard.
Yeah. So what are your last words?
Ew. I guess that's just one.
Yeah.
But like, ew. And good. This is a great example of how laws can be for good and prevent disgusting habits, because like there's just a clear, like, this is causing this. Like, this need of doctors is causing this disgusting behavior, period. So that's what I feel.
Yeah.
Truly.
The unnamed ones are so heartbreaking because you don't even have their names
I
to
know.
remember it. But even the poor elderly cinder woman or the
I
beggar.
know.
And then you have like the Jamies and the Marys who are living a tough life on the streets and have survived so much.
So bad.
But there's no doubt in my mind that Margaret and Helen were involved. I think Helen was probably the least involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I would really love to know, like, what's going on with her? Was she just a really mean woman, or was she?
I don't know, man.
She seems like the saddest of the bunch. Margaret seems conniving and manipulative and planning and like there with.
Helen's a mess.
Helen's an absolute mess.
Yeah. Maybe she just fell in love with the wrong guy and did not take proper action when things went weird.
I think she probably never had anybody take care of her, and that was the most important thing to her.
Yeah.
Like physically, like food. And
yeah. I mean, we don't know what it's like back then. It's awful.
Awful. Yeah, this is one I wouldn't normally cover because it's mostly, obviously, men serial killers, which you hate. But I felt like it was far enough away.
Yeah.
And it happened on Halloween. I mean, what's more
in a
disgusting than
tea
grave
chest.
robbers? They're also in a tea chest. These bodies are being dug up, which is like the most disgusting thing.
The most disgusting.
And yeah,
creepy as fuck.
Yeah, it's gross. So, all right, well, who should listen?
Happy Halloween. Doctors, judges, people who, maybe consider donating your body to science. And we'll put grave diggers, the good ones.
The ones who just dig the holes, not
for their job as a paid, regulated job. Yes.
Yeah, that's a tough job.
It's a tough one. I would never do it.
Yeah, that's a tough job for sure. All right. Well, you can find us on all of the platforms at
Teatime Crimes.
You can email us at
teatimecrimes@gmail.com. We love your notes.
Please rate, review, like, subscribe, send us recommendation for teas and crime, and we will be back next week. Bye-bye.
Spooky.